On her first time, he, an older millionaire, tenderly asked, "May I continue?" to the pure young woman. And there was born an inexplicable love that would challenge all social conventions. A story where the age difference transformed into the perfect harmony of two destined souls. Where are you following us from? Subscribe to the channel and hit like if you believe in love that transcends every barrier. The scent of lavender and wild blueberry floated in the air when Emmeline felt the gentle caress on her shoulder that spring afternoon in Salem. At 22, she had just experienced for the first time the intimacy of a genuine encounter, and there stood Nathaniel, a 45-year-old man, elegant with eyes that seemed to hold the stories of an entire lifetime. What she couldn't imagine was that this whispered question, "May I continue?" would resonate in her heart for a whole year, completely transforming who she thought she was. The sun was setting on the weathered bricks of the historic district, tinting the cobblestone streets with amber where their footsteps echoed. Emmeline had always believed that great stories happened only to others, those who dared, those who left their native New England towns, those who didn't carry the weight of family traditions on their delicate shoulders. Yet, in that exchange of glances with Nathaniel, something simultaneously broke and rebuilt itself. There are moments that contain an entire lifetime, her grandmother, keeper of New England traditions, had told her. Instance when your soul recognizes another, before your mind even understands why. Returning to her small studio in the artisan quarter, her fingers still impregnated with clay, Emmeline contemplated the ceramic pieces she had created. Each bore the subtle imprint of colonial patterns, a heritage of passion passed down through generations. But for the first time, she wondered if her creations only reflected the past, or if they could also contain promises of a future she had never dared to imagine. That night, lying on her bed with linens embroidered with New England motifs, she closed her eyes and let her thoughts drift toward Nathaniel. His deep voice, his quiet confidence, the way his hands, those of a man who had lived, had held the bowl she had crafted, as if he were holding an invaluable treasure. She surprised herself by smiling in the darkness. "We are the guardians of our own prison," she whispered in the silence of her room, repeating the words Nathaniel had spoken while examining her creations. "But we also hold the keys." The distant chime of the town clock marked midnight, and with it Emmeline felt that a door had just opened in her life, a door she had never noticed before. Behind it stretched an unknown path, frightening and magnificent all at once, a path where the scent of lavender and wild blueberry would guide her toward unexplored territories of her own heart. The Hayes family workshop came alive at dawn, as it had every morning for 3 generations. In the inner courtyard where century-old wisteria offered generous shade, Thomas Hayes, Emmeline's father, was already preparing the kilns. His robust hands, marked by 40 years of working with clay, manipulated the firewood with the precision of an orchestra conductor. "You seem elsewhere this morning, my daughter," he observed, watching Emmeline prepare the clay with less assured gestures than usual. "The orders for the Heritage Festival are approaching. This is no time for daydreaming." Emmeline nodded silently, but her thoughts wandered to yesterday's encounter. How could she explain to her father, the inflexible guardian of traditions, that for the first time she was considering a horizon that extended beyond the boundaries of Salem? "I received a proposal," she finally said, her eyes fixed on the clay she was kneading. "A gallery in New York is interested in my pieces inspired by colonial art." The silence that followed was more eloquent than any reprimand. In the Hayes family, New York represented the antithesis of their values, a world where authenticity was lost in favor of artifice, where traditions were diluted in modernity. "It's that New Yorker, isn't it? The one who's been lurking around the artisans for months." Thomas's voice betrayed more concern than anger. "Emmeline, people like him don't understand our world. They collect our creations as they collect experiences, without genuine commitment." The potter's wheel turned slowly under her fingers as Emmeline shaped a vase with delicate patterns. How could she tell him that Nathaniel had seen something in her creations that even her family had never noticed? A hidden boldness beneath traditional forms, a unique voice waiting to be fully expressed. "It's just an exhibition, Dad. Not a permanent departure." The look her father gave her contained the entire Hayes family history, the visceral attachment to this New England land, the wariness toward anything from elsewhere, the unconfessed fear of seeing loved ones leave. That evening, Walking through the old streets of Salem, Emmeline spotted Nathaniel at a cafe table. Their eyes met, and he gestured for her to join him. Her heart quickened, because of the invitation or the fear of being seen by a family acquaintance. She hesitated for a moment, then crossed the cobblestone square. "You seem to be carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders," said Nathaniel, serving her a glass of water infused with thyme. "Can I help?" The last rays of the sun played in his salt and pepper hair, illuminating his features marked by experience. For the first time, Emmeline truly confided in him, pouring out her doubts, her aspirations, and the conflict tearing her between family loyalty and the desire to take flight. "Sometimes," Nathaniel murmured, brushing her hand, "the greatest act of love toward our roots is daring to spread our wings." The town square was awakening under a golden light, the kind that bathes New England May mornings and seems suspended outside of time. Emmeline had made it a habit to go there early, before tourists invaded the cafes. It had become their ritual, hers and Nathaniel's, a shared coffee at dawn when the town still belonged to them. "I have something to show you," he announced that morning, a mysterious smile on his lips. He guided her through a maze of alleyways to a small weathered blue door. The key turned in the ancient lock, revealing a space bathed in light, an abandoned studio with exposed beams and thick walls. "It was once a glassmaker's studio," Nathaniel explained, opening the shutters, releasing dust particles that danced in the sun's rays. "I bought it last week. I thought you could create your pieces for the New York exhibition here." Away from prying eyes, but still rooted in the historic heart of Salem, Emmeline was speechless, touching the worn shelves with her fingertips, already imagining her creations taking shape in this space charged with history. It was Nathaniel's first gesture that went beyond conversations and walks, a concrete act that materialized his faith in her talent. "Why are you doing this for me?" she finally asked, troubled by this unexpected generosity. Nathaniel approached her, his eyes reflecting a vulnerability he usually concealed behind his confidence. "Because I recognize that look," he whispered. "The one of someone who carries an entire universe within, but hasn't yet found the space to fully unfold it." That day, for the first time, they truly talked about their lives. Nathaniel revealed that he hadn't always been the successful entrepreneur everyone saw. He had known failure, bankruptcy, doubt. His rise in the business world had been punctuated by painful falls and new beginnings. "The success people admire is just the tip of the iceberg," he confided, as he helped her install her potter's wheel in the new studio. "No one sees the sleepless nights, the compromises, the moments when you wonder if it's all worth it." But what Nathaniel didn't say, what Emmeline was just beginning to suspect, was that behind his generosity perhaps lay something else, a secret that illuminated his actions in a different light. In the days that followed, the studio became their refuge. Emmeline worked with clay, creating pieces bolder than anything she had dared to make before, while Nathaniel sometimes observed her discreetly, bringing her fragrant teas and ideas gathered from his travels. However, whispers began to spread through the neighborhood. The Hayes daughter had been seen entering that mysterious studio. People talked about that older man, that New Yorker who took a strange interest in local artisans, and when Rebecca, Emmeline's cousin, questioned her directly at the morning market, she felt the weight of judgment behind the apparent curiosity. "You should be careful," Rebecca warned her, selecting fresh herbs. "Nobody really knows who he is, what he wants. And your father, he's beginning to ask questions." That evening, returning to the family home, Emmeline felt her father's penetrating gaze follow each of her movements. Unspoken words accumulated like clouds before a storm. In her room, she contemplated the sketches of her new creations, pieces that fused tradition and modernity in a way she would never have imagined possible just weeks before. "When heart and mind awaken together," Nathaniel had said, "even the oldest walls can shelter new dreams." The discovery was as brutal as it was unexpected. While helping Nathaniel organize documents in his temporary office near Market Street, Emmeline came across an old photograph tucked between two files. A woman with delicate features smiled at the camera, brown hair, almond eyes, olive skin typical of the South. What was disturbing wasn't so much her beauty as her striking resemblance to Emmeline herself. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned the photograph over. On the back, a date 10 years ago, and a name, Catherine. The world seemed to waver around her. "Who is this?" she asked when Nathaniel returned with 2 cups of coffee, her voice more fragile than she would have liked. Nathaniel's face froze, as if a veil had fallen, revealing a carefully concealed pain. He took the photograph with a tenderness that hurt Emmeline more than any explanation could. "My wife," he answered simply, sitting heavily on the worn couch. "She died in a car accident in New York 10 years ago." The silence that followed was deafening. Emmeline felt an icy wave engulf her. Was she merely a substitute, the ghost of a lost love that Nathaniel was desperately trying to resurrect? "The resemblance is unsettling," she murmured, unable to tear her gaze from this woman who could have been her sister. "I noticed it from our first meeting," Nathaniel admitted, his eyes not leaving the photograph. "It's perhaps what initially drew me to you, I can't deny that. But what made me stay, Emmeline, is everything you are that she wasn't. Your passion for your art, your deep connection with your roots, your way of seeing beauty in what others consider ordinary." His words should have reassured her, but instead they dug an abyss of doubt in her mind. How could she discern truth from fantasy? How could she know if what he saw in her wasn't simply the reflection of a love idealized by grief? In the days that followed, Emmeline immersed herself in her work with a new, almost painful intensity. Each piece she created seemed to bear the imprint of this disturbance. More tormented lines, more intense colors, forms that expressed a search for identity beyond appearances. One evening, as she worked late in the studio Nathaniel had offered her, the door opened softly. It was her father, Thomas Hayes, whose imposing silhouette stood in the doorway. He silently observed his daughter's new creations, his expression indecipherable in the dim light. "I've heard the rumors," he finally said, touching a particularly bold piece with his fingertips. "This New Yorker, his deceased wife who resembled you?" Emmeline froze. News traveled so quickly in this neighborhood of thick walls but keen ears. "It's not what you think, Dad." Thomas approached his daughter, his gaze softened by genuine concern. "I don't know what to think, Emmeline. I only know that I see you changing, moving away from us, from our traditions, and I'm afraid that you'll lose yourself in a story that may not be yours." These words touched Emmeline more deeply than she would have imagined. Wasn't this exactly what she feared? Being the secondary character in someone else's life story, rather than the author of her own. That night, lying on the small camp bed she had installed in the studio, she contemplated the shadows the moon cast through the ancient stained glass. The question Nathaniel had asked during their first intimate moment, "May I continue?" now took on a different, more complex dimension. "We are all haunted by our ghosts," he had said one day. "Courage isn't making them disappear, but learning to dance with them without letting them lead the dance." But Emmeline wasn't sure which ghosts she was really dancing with, Nathaniel's or her own. Boston spread out before their eyes from Beacon Hill, a patchwork of red brick buildings and modern glass towers bathed in the evening light. Emmeline had never left Salem before, and this first trip together marked a turning point. Nathaniel had proposed this getaway as a respite, away from the watchful eyes and whispers of Salem. "This is where I started my career," he explained, showing her an elegant brownstone near Boston Common. "I was young, ambitious, and terribly naive." They wandered through Boston streets, discovering hidden courtyards, staircases leading to new perspectives, just as they navigated their relationship, taking detours, discovering new emotional landscapes. It was during dinner at a typical tavern between the clam chowder and the cranberry cobbler that Nathaniel made his most difficult confession. "There's something you should know," he said, his gaze suddenly avoiding hers. "I have heart problems, a congenital malformation that has worsened with age. The doctors—" he hesitated, searching for words. "The doctors aren't optimistic about the long term." Emmeline's world seemed to waver a second time. First the resemblance to Catherine, now this, as if the universe were determined to place obstacles between them, or perhaps to send her signals she refused to hear. "Why tell me this now?" she asked, her voice barely audible in the warm atmosphere of the restaurant. "Because I see how you've looked at me since you discovered Catherine's photo, as if you're trying to understand if what I feel for you is authentic or an attempt to recreate something lost." He took her hand across the table, his fingers slightly trembling. "I wanted you to know that for me, every day counts. I don't have the luxury of living in the past or building illusions. What I feel for you is rooted in the present, the only time that truly belongs to me." This unexpected vulnerability transformed something in Emmeline. The crack that had formed in her trust didn't disappear, but she began to see Nathaniel differently, no longer as a mysterious man with a troubled past, but as a human being confronted with his own fragility. The next day, they visited the Museum of Fine Arts. Before a Winslow Homer painting depicting the New England coast, Nathaniel paused for a long time. "Look how he captures this precise moment when everything comes together," he murmured. "That's what I admire in art. Its ability to seize those instants when destiny is decided, when masks fall away." Emmeline observed him surreptitiously, realizing that perhaps they too were living through one of those pivotal moments. In the contemporary art gallery, she was drawn to an installation that blended traditional ceramics with modern techniques, a dialogue between past and present that resonated deeply with her own artistic questions. On their last evening in Boston, as they contemplated the waters of the Charles River from the Longfellow Bridge, Nathaniel handed her a small carved wooden box. "A souvenir of our first trip," he said simply. Inside, Emmeline discovered a silver pendant depicting a stylized wild blueberry sprig, a symbol of the New England she had never left before this trip. "To remind you that sometimes we need to move away from our roots to better appreciate them." That night, in the hotel room with its antique woodwork, their intimacy was different, deeper, perhaps truer, but also tinged with an acute awareness of the fragility of everything they were building together. Returning to Salem the next day, Emmeline wore the pendant beneath her blouse like a shared secret. But upon their arrival, news awaited them that would shake the still fragile foundations of their relationship. "Irregularities have been discovered in the renovation permits for the hotel project," announced Lucas, Nathaniel's assistant, who had come to meet them at the station. "The county board has opened an investigation. All work is suspended until further notice." Nathaniel's face instantly hardened, regaining the mask of the businessman that Salem's artisans knew. "Who's behind this?" he asked curtly. "We don't know yet, but—" Lucas hesitated, casting an embarrassed glance toward Emmeline. "Some say it's the Hayes family who alerted the authorities." The news spread through Salem like a nor'easter, sweeping everything in its path. The county board's investigation had revealed violations of historic preservation standards in Nathaniel's hotel project. Local media had seized upon it, transforming what might have been just an administrative error into a full-blown scandal. The Hayes workshop had become strangely silent. Thomas avoided his daughter's gaze, focusing exclusively on his backlogged orders. Emmeline, meanwhile, oscillated between doubt and loyalty, unable to believe that her family would deliberately try to harm Nathaniel, but troubled by their equivocal silence. "Is it true?" she finally asked her father as they worked side by side, shaping clay in a heavy silence. "Was it our family who reported the irregularities?" Thomas set down his tools, wiping his hands on his worn apron. His eyes, usually so lively, seemed to have aged 10 years in a few days. "Your Uncle William sits on the Heritage Council," he answered simply. "He did what he thought was right to protect our legacy. This New Yorker, he claimed to respect our traditions, but his original plans called for transforming half the historic district into luxury boutiques for tourists." The revelation struck Emmeline like a physical blow. The original plans. Did that mean Nathaniel had lied about his intentions from the beginning? "You don't understand," Thomas continued, his voice softening at the sight of his daughter's evident distress. "These people come here. They buy our homes, our workshops. They promise to preserve our heritage, then it all becomes a facade, a backdrop for wealthy visitors who will never stay long enough to understand the soul of this place." That night, Emmeline desperately tried to reach Nathaniel. Her calls went unanswered. The studio he had given her remained locked, the key turning in a lock that suddenly seemed to belong to another world, another life. It was Rebecca, her cousin, who brought her the news the following morning, as Emmeline wandered through the Market Street Market, her mind elsewhere. "He's gone," she announced without preamble. "Your New Yorker. He took the train to New York at dawn. The workers received a letter announcing the suspension of the project and 3 months' compensation. After that, no one knows. Gone without a word, without an explanation." The betrayal was doubly painful, that of Nathaniel, who had perhaps lied about his intentions for Salem, and now this silent flight that seemed to confirm all her family's warnings. In the afternoon, driven by a mixture of anger and despair, Emmeline went to the temporary office Nathaniel had occupied near Market Street. The door was ajar, the space almost entirely emptied. Only Lucas remained there, gathering the last documents. "He asked me to give you this," he said, handing her an envelope, carefully avoiding her gaze. With trembling hands, Emmeline opened it to discover a handwritten letter and a train ticket to New York, dated for the following week. Emmeline, appearances condemn me, and perhaps rightly so. The plans your uncle discovered were indeed the originals, conceived before I truly understood the value of what I risked destroying. Before I met you, before I learned to see Salem through your eyes. I must return to New York to try to salvage what can be saved. Not the commercial project as it was initially planned, but something different, something that would truly respect the soul of this town you've taught me to love. If you want to hear the whole story, if you still believe there might be truth beyond appearances, come join me in New York. If not, I'll understand. Some cracks cannot be repaired, even by the most skilled hands. With all my love, imperfect but sincere, Nathaniel. The letter slipped through her fingers, falling to the dusty floor of the now empty office. Emmeline stood there, motionless, as the sun set, casting long shadows through the curtainless windows. Sometimes, Nathaniel had told her during their first conversation at the artisans' market, it's in broken pieces that we discover the true nature of what composes them. The next day, at dawn, Emmeline stood before her potter's wheel in the family workshop. Between her hands the clay took shape, not according to the traditional patterns she had mastered since childhood, but in a new, more personal language, where the crack was not concealed but integrated into the design, highlighted by a gold thread following the Japanese kintsugi technique. Thomas observed her in silence, then approached softly. "You've made your decision," he said, a statement rather than a question. Emmeline nodded, her fingers not leaving the moist clay. "I need to know, Dad. Even if the truth hurts, even if I'm wrong, I need to see with my own eyes." New York in June had nothing in common with the New England that Emmeline had always known. The grey sky, the fine rain that had fallen continuously since her arrival, the frantic rhythm of pedestrians jostling in the subway, everything seemed to confirm the prejudices her family maintained about the metropolis. Standing before the brownstone building where Nathaniel had arranged to meet her, in Greenwich Village, she hesitated. The train ticket he had left her, a gesture both presumptuous and hopeful, had first irritated her, then intrigued her. What was she really seeking here? An explanation? A reconciliation? Or perhaps simply confirmation that her instinct hadn't deceived her? The intercom crackled when she pressed the button marked N. "Wells, it's me," she said simply, her voice slightly trembling. The door opened without any voice responding. In the old elevator that took her to the 5th floor, Emmeline tried to calm the disordered beating of her heart. She was no longer the shy young Potter from Salem, she told herself. This journey, this decision to come to New York despite her family's warnings, proved that she had changed. The apartment door was ajar. Upon entering, Emmeline was immediately struck by the light. Contrary to the grey impression of the city, the space was bathed in a soft clarity that filtered through immense windows. The white walls were adorned with artwork, mainly contemporary ceramics and black and white photographs. "You came." Nathaniel stood in a doorway, different from the man she had known in Salem. More vulnerable, perhaps, without the mask of the confident entrepreneur he wore in New England. He wore a simple white shirt, sleeves rolled up revealing sinewy forearms, and his salt and pepper hair looked more silver in this New York light. "I needed to understand," Emmeline replied, keeping her distance. "The plans for Salem, your hasty departure. Who are you really, Nathaniel?" He gestured for her to follow him into a generously proportioned living room. On a glass coffee table lay documents, plans, contracts, photographs of Salem. "I'm not the man your family believes me to be," he began, sitting across from her, "nor perhaps the one you imagined." He then told her a story that no one in Salem knew, how, after Catherine's death, he had lost not only his wife, but his moral compass, how he had launched into increasingly ambitious real estate projects, sometimes sacrificing authenticity for profit, how a minor heart attack 3 years earlier had forced him to reconsider his life and his choices. "The Salem project was to be my redemption," he explained, his gaze never leaving hers. a way to create something that would truly respect the heritage while giving it new life. But I didn't really know the town, its inhabitants, its soul. The first plans were a mistake, Emmeline completed, beginning to understand. A mistake born of ignorance, yes. He rose, handing her a new folder. This is what I'm trying to save now. A different project, inspired by what I've learned thanks to you. The new plans provided for the renovation of several historic buildings, but with absolute respect for their original architecture. The emphasis was on creating spaces where local artisans could work and exhibit their creations, with affordable housing, to allow young Salem residents to remain in the historic center. That's why I came back to New York, he concluded. To convince the investors to accept this change of direction, to make them understand that true value isn't always measured in terms of immediate profit. Emmeline remained silent, assimilating these revelations. Part of her wanted to believe him immediately, to accept this version that corresponded to the man she had fallen in love with. But another part, more cautious, the one that carried the voice of her father and generations of wary Hayeses, still resisted. And the resemblance to Catherine, she finally asked, addressing the subject that had haunted her since Boston. Is it really a coincidence? Nathaniel's face darkened, an old pain rising to the surface. No, he admitted after a long silence. It's not a coincidence. He rose and went to retrieve a photo album from a bookshelf. Opening it, he revealed images yellowed by time, an older woman who strangely resembled Emmeline's grandmother, alongside a young Catherine. Your great-aunt Eleanor and Catherine were friends. It was she who told me about you before her death. She made me promise to watch over you, to help you develop your talent beyond the limits of Salem. I never intended to... He hesitated, searching for words. I hadn't planned to become attached to you in this way. This revelation struck Emmeline like a blow to the heart. Everything she thought she knew about their meeting, about their feelings, suddenly seemed called into question. So all this was a mission for you, a promise to keep. At the beginning, yes, he acknowledged, his honesty brutal but necessary. But then, Emmeline, I got to know you, not as Catherine's shadow or as Eleanor's protégé, but as yourself. Unique, talented, rooted in your traditions but dreaming of new horizons. The rain intensified against the New York windows, creating a sound barrier between them and the outside world. In this unfamiliar apartment, far from the familiar streets of Salem, Emmeline felt strangely free to judge for herself without the weight of family expectations or provincial prejudices. I don't know if I can believe you, she finally said, her voice firmer than she would have imagined. But I know I can't return to Salem without having tried to understand, without having seen for myself what New York can offer me, what you can offer me. Nathaniel nodded slowly, understanding what she wasn't explicitly saying, that she needed time, space to reflect, that she hadn't come for him, not solely at least, but also for herself. There's a gallery in Chelsea that's interested in your work, he said, handing her a business card. I showed them photographs of your creations. They'd like to meet you, see more pieces. It's an opportunity, Emmeline, whether you decide to forgive me or not. When she left the apartment that evening, to return to the small hotel where she had booked a room, the rain had stopped. The lights of New York reflected in the puddles, creating ephemeral mirrors on the sidewalks. The most important choices, her grandmother had told her, are those that force us to become fully ourselves, even when that means disappointing those we love. For the first time since her arrival in New York, Emmeline felt that she was truly breathing. The Blue Clay Gallery, nestled in a narrow Chelsea street, represented everything Emmeline had imagined about New York artistic spaces. Minimalist, with its white walls and carefully studied lighting, it showcased each piece like a unique treasure. Madison Walker, the owner with short hair and a piercing gaze, welcomed her with undisguised curiosity. Nathaniel showed me photographs of your creations, she said, guiding her through the space. I saw something rare in them, a dialogue between tradition and innovation that sacrifices neither. Emmeline observed the exhibited ceramics, pieces by renowned artists whose work she had studied in books but never seen in person. The gap between these contemporary works and her own creations suddenly seemed vertiginous. I don't know if my work belongs here, she murmured, intimidated by the gallery's refined elegance. Madison smiled, a smile that softened her angular features. It's precisely because your work is different that it interests me. New York is full of artists who copy trends. What's lacking are authentic voices, rooted in a living tradition. They spent the afternoon discussing a possible exhibition, Madison explaining the workings of the New York art market, collectors' expectations, how a young provincial artist could stand out in this competitive universe. You would need to create at least 20 new pieces, she concluded. Works that tell your journey, your unique vision. I can offer you a workspace in the gallery's basement. Many artists I represent use it when they're passing through New York. The offer was generous, unexpected. A door was opening to what Emmeline had always considered an inaccessible dream. Yet as she left the gallery in the declining light of the New York afternoon, a strange melancholy invaded her. In the days that followed, she settled into the studio beneath the gallery. A raw space with stone walls, equipped with a modern potter's wheel and an electric kiln that bore no resemblance to the traditional wood-fired kilns of the Hayses. Her hands, accustomed to gestures passed down through generations, had to adapt to new tools, new techniques. Nathaniel visited her occasionally, respecting the distance she had established between them. He brought her books on contemporary ceramics, took her to visit museums and exhibitions that might nourish her inspiration. Their relationship had changed, becoming more intellectual, almost platonic, as if the New York revelation had created an invisible barrier that neither dared to cross. One evening, as she worked late in the underground studio, the ring of her phone broke the concentrated silence. It was her mother, whose trembling voice announced that her father had suffered a health scare. Nothing serious, she immediately reassured her, just exhaustion and tension. But in what she didn't say, Emmeline perceived a silent accusation. Her absence weighed on the family, on the workshop that functioned at reduced capacity without her skilled hands. That night, unable to sleep in her hotel room, Emmeline wandered the streets of New York. The city, which had initially intimidated her, now seemed strangely familiar, not like a home but like a mirror that reflected back an image of herself she had never considered before. Near Washington Square Park, she sat on a bench, observing the last night owls and the first workers crossing paths in this perpetual urban ballet. Her phone vibrated, a message from Nathaniel, who had heard about her father and was concerned for her. "Do you want to return to Salem?" "I can accompany you if you wish." His solicitude touched her, but also awakened the doubt that slumbered within her. How many of his actions were motivated by a promise made to her great-aunt? How many by genuine feelings? And she herself, what was she really seeking in New York? An artistic career or an escape from family responsibilities that had become too heavy? The next day, in the gallery studio, Emmeline shaped a series of small bowls according to an ancestral technique her father had taught her. Each piece bore the imprint of this duality that tore at her: traditional New England forms disrupted by contemporary lines, ancient glazes applied in resolutely modern ways. Madison, observing her work, nodded with approval. "There's a tension in these pieces," she commented. "A struggle between the old and the new that makes them deeply moving." "It's not a technique," Emmeline replied softly. "It's my life right now." That evening she finally accepted Nathaniel's invitation to dine at his apartment. He cooked for her revisited New England dishes: a clam chowder with shellfish from the Hudson River Farmers Market, a cranberry-glazed lamb that evoked the New England hills. "I miss you," he said simply as they shared a glass of wine on his balcony, contemplating the New York rooftops bathed in evening light. "Not just as what we were becoming in Salem. I miss you as a presence, as a conversation, as a way of looking at the world." Emmeline felt something break within her, not from pain but like a dam giving way under the pressure of feelings too long contained. "I don't know who I am anymore, Nathaniel," she confessed, her voice barely audible above the distant sounds of the city. "In Salem, I was Thomas Hayes's daughter, the heir to a tradition. Here I'm no one and everyone at once, free but uprooted." He didn't try to comfort her with easy words, understanding the depth of her confusion. Instead, he showed her something he had kept since their first meeting, a small bowl she had created, sold at the Salem Artisans Market. "So you see this piece," he said, holding it delicately. "The first time I saw it, I knew you weren't simply the heir to a tradition. You were its reinventor, its translator for a new century." That night, Emmeline stayed in Nathaniel's apartment, not to rediscover what they had shared in Salem, but to explore what they might perhaps become in New York. Two people in transformation, seeking a balance between past and future, between roots and flight. At dawn, as the nascent light redesigned the contours of the city, she made her decision. "I need to return to Salem," she announced to Nathaniel, who was preparing coffee in the open kitchen. "Not permanently, but to face what I left behind, to understand what I truly want to bring with me." He nodded, understanding what she wasn't saying, that she needed to reconcile with her roots before she could truly move away from them. "I'll wait for you," he said simply. Not as an obligation tied to an ancient promise, but as a man who has learned, thanks to you, that some waits are worth all the detours. The Amtrak train sped through changing landscapes, from the urbanized north toward the sunnier south. As the train progressed, Emmeline felt a transformation taking place within her, as if each mile traveled toward Salem re-established a connection with a part of herself she had temporarily set aside. The New England countryside finally appeared through the window. Fields of goldenrod with golden hues, century-old oaks, villages perched on rocky hills. This landscape that she had always taken for granted now appeared to her with a renewed beauty, seen through the filter of absence. At Salem Station, no one was waiting for her. She'd only told her mother of her return, asking her to keep the news to herself. She wanted to rediscover her town at her own pace, like a stranger returning home after a long journey. The historic district stood unchanged, silent witness to centuries of stories. Emmeline walked through the main gate, her bag containing some of the new pieces she had created in New York. The familiar streets seemed both identical and different, as if her gaze had changed, now capable of simultaneously seeing the beauty and the limits of this world that had formed her. Her first visit was not to the family home, but to the studio Nathaniel had offered her. The key turned in the lock with resistance, as if the place itself hesitated to welcome her after her absence. Dust had covered the tools, the potter's wheel, the shelves where some unfinished pieces waited for hands that had never completed them. Emmeline opened the windows, letting in the light and warm New England air. On a table, she arranged her New York creations alongside her Salem works, two chapters of the same story, two expressions of the same voice seeking its harmony. In the afternoon, she finally decided to go to the family workshop. With a beating heart, she pushed open the door to the inner courtyard where the characteristic sound of her father's wheel was recognizable among thousands. Thomas Hayes looked up from his work, his hands stopping on the clay. In his gaze, Emmeline read surprise, relief, but also reserve, as if he feared showing too much emotion. "So you're back," he said simply, wiping his hands on his worn apron. "For a while," she specified, approaching with a new confidence. "How are you, Dad? Mom told me about your health scare." Thomas shrugged, that typically New England gesture that minimized concerns. "It was nothing. Just a warning from an aging body." But Emmeline noticed the dark circles under his eyes, the slight pallor of his complexion usually tanned by the midday sun. The workshop itself seemed different, less orderly, as if Emmeline's absence had disrupted a subtle balance in the family choreography. Her mother appeared in the kitchen doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her face lit up, and she embraced her daughter with undisguised emotion. "You've been missed," she murmured, touching Emmeline's hair as if to ensure she was real. "New York has changed you. You seem different." "Not changed, Mom. Just more complete, perhaps." That evening, around the family table, conversations carefully avoided sensitive topics. Nathaniel, the suspended hotel project, the New York exhibition being prepared. Instead, they talked about current orders, recently engaged cousins, the apple trees that promised a good harvest this year. It was the next day, as she helped her father in the workshop, that the real conversation finally began. Thomas was preparing the clay, his precise gestures testifying to decades of experience. "You know," he said without preamble, "I met your great-aunt Eleanor once shortly before her death. She talked about you, about your talent that deserved more than our little provincial workshop." Emmeline froze, surprised by this unexpected revelation. "You never told me about that." Thomas smiled sadly, kneading the clay with increased concentration. "What could I have said? That I agreed with her, that I knew, deep down, that you were destined for more than what we could offer you here." In his voice, Emmeline perceived an old pain, that of a man torn between his love for his daughter and the awareness of his own limitations. This New Yorker, Nathaniel, Thomas continued, pronouncing this name for the first time since her return. Eleanor had mentioned him to me as well. She said he could help you find your way. I refused to listen. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly assembling in Emmeline's mind. Her father's hostility toward Nathaniel wasn't just that of a New Englander wary of a New Yorker, but also that of a father fearing to lose his daughter to a destiny he himself had glimpsed. So you knew about the promise he made to her? Thomas nodded, avoiding her gaze. I guessed it when I saw him watching you at the artisans' market. He had that look, the same as Eleanor's when she talked about your future. This revelation shook Emmeline more deeply than she would have imagined. Her father, this inflexible guardian of traditions, had perhaps always known that one day she would need to take flight. Why not accept it then? Why push Uncle William to report the project? Thomas abandoned the clay, wiping his hands with slow, measured movements. Fear, I suppose. Fear of losing you. Fear that you'd discover that the world beyond Salem has more to offer you than everything I've worked for all my life. He finally looked at her directly. And perhaps also jealousy. This man could offer you opportunities that I could never give you. This disarming honesty touched Emmeline to the heart. She approached her father, taking his rough hands in hers. You gave me the most precious gift, Dad. An art, a passion, roots. Without that, I would be nothing, neither in New York nor elsewhere. In the days that followed, Emmeline divided her time between the family workshop and the one Nathaniel had offered her. In the latter, she created new, bold pieces where the New York influence mingled with the ancestral techniques of the Hayes. In the former, she helped her father, listening with renewed attention to his advice, rediscovering the wisdom hidden in gestures she had considered routine. One afternoon, as she worked alone in the Blue Street studio, the door opened softly. Rebecca, her cousin, appeared in the doorway, hesitant. I heard you were back, she said, observing Emmeline's new creations with curiosity, and that you'd be leaving again soon. In a week, Emmeline confirmed. The exhibition in New York opens in a month. I need to finalize the last pieces. Rebecca approached, touching with caution a vase with bold forms where traditional New England motifs seemed to dissolve then reform in a contemporary language. It's different, she admitted, but you can still recognize the Hayes touch. This comment, coming from her cousin who had always embodied attachment to traditions, touched Emmeline more than praise from Madison or Nathaniel could have. You know, Rebecca continued, sitting on a stool, not everyone holds it against you for leaving. Some of us, maybe, envy you a little for having dared. This unexpected confession opened a breach in the invisible wall Emmeline felt erected between her and her community since her return. Behind the judgments and whispers, perhaps hid other more complex feelings, admiration, curiosity, an unconfessed desire for change. On the last day before her departure, Emmeline took her father to visit the Blue Street studio. She showed him the pieces she had created for the New York exhibition, inwardly trembling as she awaited his verdict. Thomas observed each creation at length, sometimes touching the clay with his fingertips, as if to read its history through its texture. This is your best work, he finally said, his voice husky with contained emotion. You've found your voice, Emmeline. Different from mine, but right. As she was leaving, he handed her a small, carefully wrapped package. From your mother and me, for your exhibition. On the train taking her back to New York the next day, Emmeline opened the package to discover a small ceramic medallion, an ancient piece her great-grandfather had created, depicting an oak branch. On a folded piece of paper, her father had written, "So you never forget where your hands come from, even when they create what mine could never have imagined." Through the train window, the New England landscape receded, but Emmeline felt she was carrying it with her in a new way, no longer as a weight or an obligation, but as a living force that would nourish her New York creations. New York in July vibrated with a feverish energy. The outdoor cafes overflowed with life, the parks filled with New Yorkers enjoying the long summer evenings, and the galleries prepared their flagship exhibitions for the cultural season starting in September. At Blue Clay, Emmeline's exhibition was taking shape. Madison had reserved the gallery's main space for her creations, a rare honor for a debut artist. Invitations had been sent mentioning a new voice between New England tradition and contemporary vision. In the underground studio, Emmeline was putting the finishing touches on her masterpiece, an installation composed of 12 vases forming a spiral, each representing a moment in her personal transformation, from the first with strictly traditional forms to the last resolutely contemporary. The ensemble visually narrated her journey between Salem and New York. Nathaniel visited her regularly, but their relationship had evolved into something more nuanced, neither lovers nor simply friends, two people linked by a mutual understanding that transcended conventional definitions. "How do you feel as the exhibition approaches?" he asked one evening, as they shared a glass of wine in a small bistro near the gallery. Emmeline contemplated his question, seeking the right words. "Like I'm standing on the edge of a cliff," she finally replied, "terrified by the void before me but unable to turn back." Nathaniel smiled, recognizing in this metaphor his own experience of decisive moments. "I have something to tell you," he announced, his expression becoming more serious. "The Salem project. It's going to resume, but differently. The investors have accepted the new plans, those that truly respect the heritage and involve local artisans." This news should have delighted Emmeline, but she perceived a hesitation in Nathaniel's voice. "There's something else, isn't there?" He nodded slowly. "I've decided to withdraw from the project, to entrust it to a team that includes several Salem residents, including your cousin Jacob." Emmeline stared at him, surprised by this unexpected decision. "Why? It was your project, your vision." "Precisely," he replied with a melancholic smile. "It was my vision for Salem. But I've understood, partly thanks to you, that what the town needs is a vision born from its own soil, carried by those who have their roots there." This conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. For the first time, Emmeline saw Nathaniel not as the sophisticated New Yorker who had come to transform her life, nor as the man linked to her by an ancient promise, but as someone who was evolving in parallel with her, confronted with his own questions, his own transformations. The week before the exhibition, an unexpected letter arrived from a Salem law firm. Emmeline opened it with apprehension to discover that she was the heir to a historic mill house in the Salem countryside, a legacy from her great-aunt Eleanor that had never been revealed until now. "This property was intended to be transferred to you when you had found your own artistic voice, according to the wishes of Mrs. Eleanor Hayes," the letter specified. Emmeline sat on the studio floor, trying to assimilate this news. Her great-aunt, this woman she had barely known, had not only orchestrated her meeting with Nathaniel, but was now leaving her a property, as if she had planned from beyond the grave the different stages of her liberation. This revelation created a strange symmetry in her relationship with Nathaniel. She, whom everyone in Salem considered disadvantaged compared to his fortune and influence, now found herself the owner of a historic property, while he, perceived as the wealthy New York entrepreneur, had lost a large part of his fortune trying to preserve rural American heritage. The evening of the exhibition opening finally arrived. The gallery gradually filled with collectors, art critics, New York gallerists, curious to discover this newcomer. Emmeline, dressed in a simple but elegant dress, stood near the entrance alongside Madison, welcoming visitors with a mixture of pride and apprehension. Her creations, arranged according to a carefully elaborated path, told her story without words. The tension between tradition and innovation, between rootedness and flight, between fidelity to origins and exploration of new territories. In the middle of the evening, as she was explaining the creation process of one of her pieces to an influential critic, Emmeline spotted a familiar silhouette at the gallery entrance. Her father, Thomas Hayes, stood there, visibly uncomfortable in his Sunday suit, observing the space with a mixture of intimidation and curiosity. "Excuse me for a moment," she murmured to the critic, before crossing the gallery to join her father. "Dad, I didn't know you were coming," she said, moved by his unexpected presence. Thomas shrugged, that characteristic gesture that minimized grand gestures. "Your mother insisted. She said I couldn't miss my daughter's biggest day." Emmeline guided him through the exhibition, presenting each piece, explaining the techniques she had used. Some learned from him, others discovered in New York. Thomas listened attentively, sometimes touching the clay with his fingertips, as if to verify its quality. Before the spiral installation, he paused at length, his gaze following the progression of forms, from the most traditional to the boldest. "This is our story," he finally said. "Not just yours, but that of all the Hayeses. How we've always moved forward, generation after generation, keeping one foot in the past and one eye on the future." This interpretation, so different from what Emmeline had consciously intended to express, struck her with its profound accuracy. She had created something that went beyond her individual experience to touch a more universal truth. Later in the evening, as the first visitors began to leave, Nathaniel approached her, a glass of champagne in hand. "Congratulations," he said simply. "You've created something extraordinary here." Emmeline observed the gallery where her creations were now admired, discussed, sometimes already purchased, her dreams taking form in reality. "None of this would have been possible without you," she acknowledged. Nathaniel gently shook his head. "You're wrong. All of this would have existed in one way or another. I may have accelerated the process, but your talent would have found its way." They stood side by side in a comfortable silence, watching Thomas now discussing with Madison, his New England accent resonating in the hushed space of the New York gallery. "What will you do now that you've withdrawn from the Salem project?" Emmeline finally asked. Nathaniel contemplated his glass, as if seeking the answer there. "I don't know yet. For the first time in a long time, I don't have a precise plan. It's unsettling and liberating at the same time." This vulnerability, this assumed uncertainty, touched Emmeline more deeply than all the certainties he could have displayed before. At the end of the evening, as the gallery emptied, Emmeline found herself alone with her father and Nathaniel, the two men who had, each in his own way, shaped her recent journey. "I have something to tell both of you," she announced, her decision made during this transformative evening. "I'm going back to Salem." The two men looked at her with surprise. "But your success here," Nathaniel began. "Your exhibition," her father added simultaneously. Emmeline smiled, amused by this rare unanimity between them. "I'm not leaving New York permanently, but I've received an inheritance, Great-Aunt Eleanor's mill house. I want to make something special of it. A place that could reconcile everything I've learned here, with everything I am there." In this decision was embodied all the transformation she had experienced, not a choice between two worlds, but an integration of both, a way to honor her roots while spreading her wings. That evening, walking alone toward her hotel through the New York streets, Emmeline felt a new peace invade her. For the first time since Nathaniel had entered her life with his whispered question, "May I continue?" she had the impression of holding the reins of her own story. Birdsong Mill House stood on a gentle hill, half an hour from Salem. A 17th-century building with weathered clapboard siding and sage-green shutters, it seemed to have grown naturally from the New England soil, like the maples that surrounded it. Emmeline stood in the inner courtyard, where an ancient fountain murmured its aquatic melody. The place had been abandoned for years, garden invaded by wild herbs, roof weakened by weather, dusty interior where cobwebs had replaced tapestries. Yet beneath this layer of neglect, she perceived the extraordinary potential of the place. The perfect proportions of the rooms, the light that streamed through the mullioned windows, the particular acoustics that transformed birdsong into a symphony. "It's a beautiful challenge," commented Nathaniel, who accompanied her on this first visit. He had come from Salem for the occasion, now that he had temporarily settled in a small apartment near the historic district to finalize the transition of the hotel project. "More than a challenge," Emmeline replied, caressing the sun-warmed wood. "A blank canvas." In the weeks that followed, the mill house became the center of her existence. Emmeline spent her days there drawing plans, consulting local craftsmen, imagining how to transform this ancient dwelling into a place that would embody her vision, a center where tradition and innovation could harmoniously dialogue. The idea had gradually germinated, to create a space that would serve both as a personal studio, a school for young potters, and a rural gallery where contemporary artists could exhibit in a setting charged with history. The success of her New York exhibition had brought her a certain recognition, and several European galleries were now interested in her work. One September morning, as she supervised the beginning of renovation work, a car engaged in the gravel driveway. Rebecca, her cousin, stepped out, carrying a basket covered with an embroidered cloth. "I thought the workers and you might appreciate some homemade cornbread and fruit from the orchard," she explained, her smile betraying an evident curiosity about this project that all of Salem was now talking about. Emmeline welcomed her with joy, showing her around the mill house and explaining her vision. To her surprise, Rebecca listened attentively, asking pertinent questions, even suggesting ideas that testified to an artistic sensibility Emmeline had never suspected in her traditionalist cousin. "You know," Rebecca said as they shared the cornbread in the shade of a century-old maple, "many things have changed in Salem during your absence. Nathaniel's project, or rather what it's become since he entrusted it to the local team, has created discussions, debates about our way of preserving heritage while allowing the town to evolve." This observation intrigued Emmeline. She had been so absorbed in her own journey that she had barely considered how her native town might also be in transformation. "And your project here," Rebecca continued, contemplating the building that was coming alive under the artisans' efforts, "represents something important, a way to show that we can honor our roots while creating something new." As she accompanied her cousin back to her car, Emmeline was struck by the realization that what she was building wasn't just a personal project, but was inscribed in a broader dynamic, a collective questioning about the balance between preservation and renewal. In the days that followed, other visitors presented themselves at the mill house. Curious craftsmen, young potters interested in her approach, even her Uncle William, the very one who had reported the irregularities in Nathaniel's project. Each brought their questions, their doubts, sometimes their criticisms, but also an openness that contrasted with the resistance Emmeline had anticipated. One evening, as the sun was setting over the valley, tinting the mill house stones with a golden light, Nathaniel came to visit her. He had brought plans, not for the mill house, but for the former Salem Hotel project, now transformed into a collective initiative. "I wanted you to see how your ideas have influenced the evolution of the project," he explained as they spread the documents on the large wooden table in the recently restored kitchen. The new plans provided for the creation of spaces where local artisans could not only exhibit their creations, but also share their know-how with visitors. The emphasis was on authenticity, transmission, the valorization of traditional techniques in a contemporary context, exactly what Emmeline was seeking to accomplish at Birdsong Mill House. "It's as if our projects were in conversation with each other," she observed, touched by this unexpected resonance. Nathaniel nodded, his gaze traveling over the space where Emmeline had begun to install her studio, a harmonious blend of modern equipment and traditional elements. "Perhaps that's what Eleanor had foreseen from the beginning," he suggested softly. "Not simply that I would help you find your way, but that we would create together something that would transcend our individual journeys." This idea, that their meeting, orchestrated by a woman they had barely known, could have such profound ramifications, moved Emmeline. She observed Nathaniel in the declining light, this man who had entered her life as an almost mythical figure, an agent of change from elsewhere, and who now revealed himself as a traveling companion, himself in transformation. "What will you do now?" she asked, realizing he had never really answered this question since he had seeded the Salem project. Nathaniel smiled, a new light in his gaze. "I thought, if you agree, that I could help you here. Not as an investor or advisor, but as a partner. I have management skills that could complement your artistic vision." This unexpected proposal left Emmeline speechless. The idea of building something together, no longer in the complex dynamic that had characterized their beginnings, but as two individuals each bringing their strengths to a common project, opened perspectives she hadn't contemplated. "You wouldn't return to New York?" she finally asked. "New York will always be there," he replied simply, "but what we could create here is unique, and besides—" He hesitated, searching for words. "My doctor thinks the New England air would be beneficial for my heart." In this light remark, Emmeline perceived what he wasn't explicitly saying, that his choice was as personal as professional, as emotional as rational. That night, after Nathaniel's departure, Emmeline sat in the mill house courtyard, under a New England sky where the stars shone with a clarity impossible in New York. The scent of lavender and wild blueberry that floated in the air reminded her of their first meeting, that whispered question that had triggered everything. "May I continue?" The question now took on a new, deeper meaning, no longer a request for permission for a moment of intimacy, but an interrogation about the possibility of building together a future that would honor their respective journeys while creating something entirely new. Her answer, which she whispered into the New England night, was both for Nathaniel and for herself. Yes, we can continue. Together, but free. Winter had transformed New England. The bare vines traced geometric lines on the hills. The maples proudly bore their branches in the cold wind, and Birdsong Mill House had progressively metamorphosed under the combined efforts of Emmeline, Nathaniel, and local craftsmen. The East Wing now housed Emmeline's personal studio, a luminous space where several potter's wheels coexisted with an ultra-modern kiln and shelves loaded with clays of various compositions. The West Wing had been transformed into an exhibition gallery, its clapboard walls offering a perfect showcase for contemporary ceramics. In the center, the main building welcomed common spaces and lodgings for the artists in residence that the project was beginning to attract. This January morning, Emmeline observed the preparations for the first masterclass that the center would host. 5 young potters from different regions of the United States would stay for a month of intensive training, alternating between learning traditional New England techniques and contemporary experimentation. "Is everything ready for tomorrow?" Nathaniel asked, joining her in the courtyard, where a restored ancient well now served as a focal point for a carefully designed garden. Emmeline nodded, instinctively adjusting the ceramic medallion her father had given her before her New York exhibition, now her talisman in moments of uncertainty. "The rooms are prepared, the clay is delivered, and Dad will arrive tonight for the traditional throwing demonstration." This collaboration with her father, who had agreed to share his know-how with the young artists, represented for Emmeline a personal victory as significant as her New York success. Thomas Hayes, initially reluctant in the face of this project that departed from family traditions, had progressively recognized the value of this approach that preserved the essence of ancestral techniques while making them dialogue with contemporary creation. "I received news from Madison," announced Nathaniel, handing her a cup of tea infused with New England herbs. "3 of your pieces have been acquired by the Smithsonian American Art Museum. She says it's exceptional for an emerging artist." Emmeline welcomed this news with a mixture of pride and detachment. Her New York success still mattered to her, but it now inscribed itself in a broader vision, that of creating here, in this New England land, a place where other talents could blossom. In the afternoon, as she was putting the finishing touches on the pedagogical space, Rebecca arrived with several cousins, all bearing homemade dishes for the inaugural dinner planned for that evening. "The whole family will be there," announced Rebecca, with an enthusiasm that contrasted with the reserve she had manifested a few months earlier. "Even Uncle William has promised to come." This progressive reconciliation with her extended family touched Emmeline deeply. Birdsong Mill House, far from creating an additional rupture with her roots, seemed, on the contrary, to be weaving new bonds, perhaps more authentic than those based solely on traditional obligation. In early evening, the first guests began to arrive. Craftsmen from Salem, gallery owners from Boston and Providence, some collectors who had discovered Emmeline's work during her New York exhibition and who were now interested in this rural project. Thomas Hayes arrived among the last, accompanied by Emmeline's mother, and to everyone's surprise the former mayor of Salem, a respected figure who had long defended the artisanal heritage of the region. "I never thought I'd see this day," murmured Emmeline's mother, embracing her daughter, observing with wonder the transformation of the old abandoned mill house. The evening unfolded in an atmosphere of quiet celebration. Around large tables set up in the courtyard, illuminated by strings of lights and warmed by braziers, the guests shared traditional New England dishes revisited by Emmeline's cousins. Nathaniel circulated among the guests with an ease that still surprised Emmeline. He who had been perceived as the New Yorker, a figure of otherness in the Salem community, now seemed to belong to this place, conversing with the elders, discussing restoration techniques with the craftsmen, exchanging on the specificities of local clays with the young potters. In the middle of the evening, Thomas Hayes rose, naturally drawing the assembly's attention. He was not a man of grand speeches, and this initiative surprised Emmeline. "I'd like to say a few words," he began, his voice rendered slightly tremulous by emotion, or perhaps by the locally produced cider generously served. "When my daughter began to move away from family traditions, I thought she was losing herself. I didn't understand that sometimes One needs to move away to better return. His gaze swept over the assembly, pausing briefly on Nathaniel before returning to Emmeline. What she has created here is not a break with our heritage. It's her way of making it live in a changing world, and for that I am grateful to her. These words, coming from a man as sparing with compliments as Thomas Hayes, moved Emmeline to tears. She rose to embrace her father, in a gesture that seemed to seal a reconciliation deeper than all words could express. Later in the evening, as conversations continued around the tables, Nathaniel discreetly led Emmeline toward the century-old maple that dominated the center of the garden. "I have something to show you," he said, a mysterious light in his gaze. He guided her to a part of the garden they had left untouched, waiting for spring to decide on its arrangement. There, by the light of a lantern, he revealed a surprise he had prepared in secret, a carved stone bench, inlaid with fragments of ceramics with traditional New England patterns. "I asked each member of your family to bring a piece of broken pottery with a particular significance," he explained. "Your father provided fragments of the first piece you created as a child. Your mother, pieces of a wedding plate that had broken. Each fragment tells a story, and together—" "They tell our story," completed Emmeline, touching with emotion the complex mosaic where generations of Hayes creations were assembled in a new composition. This attention, this way of transforming fragments of the past into something that honored history while creating new beauty, perfectly embodied what they were trying to accomplish at Birdsong Mill House. Under the New England stars, Emmeline realized how circular her journey had been, leaving Salem to find her voice in New York, only to finally return and create something that would not have been possible without either her roots or her flight. "You know," she said softly to Nathaniel as they returned toward the light and conversations of the party, "when you first asked me, 'May I continue?' I never would have imagined where that simple yes would lead us." Nathaniel smiled, intertwining his fingers with hers. "The real question was never whether we could continue, but how we would continue, together but distinct, linked but free, faithful to our personal histories while writing something new." That night, long after the last guests had left the mill house, Emmeline remained alone in her studio, contemplating the fresh clay awaiting her hands. In this silence populated with echoes, those of the past and those of possibilities to come, she began to shape a new piece. This creation would be neither traditional nor resolutely contemporary, but something else, an expression of that unique voice she had found, neither purely of Salem nor typically of New York, but deeply, authentically her own. Spring had exploded in New England, transforming the hills into impressionist paintings. Touches of red from the wild roses, purple swathes of early wildflowers, blazing yellow of goldenrod. At Birdsong Mill House, this rebirth manifested in a creative effervescence. The first session of masterclasses had concluded with a success that exceeded Emmeline and Nathaniel's expectations. The 5 young potters departed, transformed, not only in their technique but in their artistic vision. Several had decided to prolong their stay in New England, renting temporary studios in Salem or surrounding villages. That morning, Emmeline was preparing the exhibition space for an event that perfectly symbolized the bridge she was trying to build between her two worlds. The Blue Clay Gallery from New York was organizing a decentralized exhibition at the Mill House, bringing to this rural setting works by contemporary artists that would dialogue with the creations of local craftsmen. "Madison just called," announced Nathaniel, entering the gallery where Emmeline was adjusting the lighting. "Her car broke down in Portsmouth. I sent Jacob to pick her up." Emmeline nodded, grateful for this quiet efficiency that Nathaniel brought to the project. In a few months, he had woven a network of local relationships that facilitated every aspect of their common enterprise. His discreet but essential presence perfectly complemented Emmeline's artistic vision, creating a balance that elicited the admiration of all who discovered the Mill House. "The article is out," he added, handing her a copy of the Boston Globe. The regional daily devoted a double page to the Birdsong Mill House project, presenting it as an innovative model of living heritage preservation. The article also mentioned, in parallel, the evolution of the Salem Hotel project, now managed by a local collective including several members of the Hayes family. The two initiatives were described as complementary, one revitalizing urban heritage, the other creating a bridge between rural traditions and contemporary creation. "Your father will be pleased," commented Nathaniel with a smile. They extensively quoted his interview on the importance of transmitting traditional know-how. Thomas Hayes had indeed found a new vocation in this project he had initially rejected. Having become the reference master potter for the masterclasses, he shared with communicative passion techniques that his own family had practiced for 5 generations. His presence at the mill house had become more frequent, and he had even begun to experiment himself with more contemporary approaches, influenced by the young artists he frequented. In the afternoon, as the final preparations for the vernissage were concluding, Emmeline received an unexpected call. It was the curator of the Smithsonian American Art Museum, which had acquired several of her pieces. "We're preparing an exhibition on the revival of ceramic arts in America," he explained. "Your work would occupy a central place, and we would also like to document the experience of Birdsong Mill House as an example of artisanal tradition revitalization." This institutional recognition, coming to crown months of effort, touched Emmeline deeply. It wasn't simply her personal work that was being valued, but the entire project she had initiated with Nathaniel. This attempt to create a space where tradition and innovation could nourish each other. The vernissage that evening brought together a fascinating mix of worlds that, a few months earlier, had seemed irreconcilable. New York collectors in elegant attire conversed with local craftsmen with hands marked by work. International art critics discovered with curiosity traditional New England techniques. Ambitious young potters exchanged with master craftsmen whose families had practiced the same art for generations. Madison Walker, elegant and incisive as always, circulated through the space with visible satisfaction. Her bet on Emmeline had proven judicious, and this collaboration between her New York gallery and this rural project opened new perspectives for the artists she represented. "This is exactly what the art world needs," she confided to Emmeline, as they observed the interactions among the guests. "To get out of conventional circuits, create unexpected connections, make universes that usually ignore each other dialogue." In the middle of the evening, as animated conversations filled the gallery and spilled into the mill house courtyard, Emmeline sought Nathaniel with her gaze. She found him apart, sitting on the stone bench he had created for her, seeming to take a moment of rest away from the bustle. Approaching, she immediately noticed his unusual pallor. "Is everything all right?" she asked, concern piercing in her voice. Nathaniel attempted a reassuring smile that failed to mask his discomfort. "Just a small discomfort. My heart sometimes reminds me of its limits." This sudden vulnerability, in the midst of an evening celebrating their common success, struck Emmeline as a brutal reminder of the fragility of everything they were building together. Nathaniel's heart problems, which he managed with stoic discretion, remained a shadow hovering over their projects. "You should rest," she insisted, sitting beside him. "The evening can continue without us for a while?" He nodded, for once acknowledging his limits. In this moment of shared vulnerability, away from prying eyes, something profound passed between them. A mutual acceptance that went beyond professional successes or creative challenges. "I have something to tell you," whispered Nathaniel, his gaze fixed on the stars beginning to appear in the New England sky. "I saw my cardiologist in Boston last week." Emmeline's heart tightened, anticipating bad news. "The treatments are working better than expected," he continued, a genuine smile finally illuminating his tired face. "He told me that if I continue at this pace, I could hope for more years than we thought." This "we," a simple pronoun that encompassed so much, touched Emmeline like a caress. Despite the emotional distance they had maintained these past months, focusing on their professional partnership, this word reaffirmed a deeper connection, a shared concern for their common future. "That's good news," she said simply, her hand naturally finding Nathaniel's. "The best," he confirmed, "because I have plans for this mill house, for our work together. Plans that require time." This statement, pronounced under the New England stars, contained a promise that went beyond words, that of a shared future, built stone by stone, day by day, in this place that had become the convergence point of their distinct paths. Later in the evening, as the last guests lingered over glasses of local wine and passionate discussions, Emmeline observed the illuminated mill house from the garden. Each window told a different story. Here a group of young artists gesticulating with enthusiasm, there collectors carefully examining a piece, elsewhere her father demonstrating a technique to a captivated art critic. This vision crystallized everything she had hoped to create, a living place where worlds met, where traditions breathed through their contemporary reinterpretation, where generations dialogued beyond prejudices. Madison joined her, 2 glasses of champagne in hand. "To success," she proposed, offering her a flute. "To balance," Emmeline gently corrected, her gaze embracing the living tableau that Birdsong Mill House had become. For that was indeed what she had found, at the end of this journey begun when Nathaniel had entered her life with his whispered question, not an exclusive choice between 2 worlds, but a dynamic balance, always to be reinvented, between her New England roots and her New York wings, between tradition and innovation, between her personal identity and her relationship with Nathaniel. The mill house sparkled in the night like a beacon, a tangible symbol of this hard-won balance. And in this light, Emmeline finally felt fully herself, no longer torn between contradictory loyalties but enriched by their complementary contributions. Exactly 1 year after that first whispered question, "May I continue?" Birdsong Mill House was awakening under a sky of perfect blue. The cicadas were intoning their summer song, the lavender swayed in the gentle breeze, and the century-old stones seemed to breathe in the rising heat. Emmeline stood in her studio, contemplating the piece she had just completed, a work destined for the Smithsonian American Art Museum exhibition that would open the following month in Washington, D.C. It was a complex installation composed of 12 ceramics forming a circle, each representing a month of the past year, each bearing the imprint of the transformations that had marked her journey. The first piece, with traditional forms, but already traversed by a deliberate fissure, evoked her meeting with Nathaniel. The last, created just that week, integrated fragments of the others in a harmonious composition that didn't erase the breaks, but transcended them. "This is your masterpiece," said a voice behind her. Her father stood in the doorway, his expert gaze evaluating the installation. In recent months, Thomas Hayes had metamorphosed, not by abandoning his principles or ancestral techniques, but by opening them to new possibilities, accepting that tradition could breathe through change. "I don't know if it's a masterpiece," Emmeline replied, adjusting a detail on the last piece, "but it's certainly the most honest of my creations." Her father approached, touching one of the ceramics with caution. "Do you know why I so opposed your departure for New York?" he asked, his gaze fixed on the complex details of the work. "It wasn't just the fear of losing our family tradition. It was also the fear that you would discover that I had been wrong never to try my luck beyond Salem." This unexpected confession touched Emmeline deeply. For the first time, she glimpsed her father's unfulfilled dreams, the paths he hadn't taken that had perhaps nourished his opposition to her own aspirations. "You weren't wrong, Dad," she said softly. "You made another choice, the one that corresponded to your truth, as I made mine." Thomas nodded slowly, a melancholic smile illuminating his face weathered by the years. "And look where your choice has led you," he said, encompassing with a gesture the studio where ancestral techniques coexisted with ultra-modern equipment. "You've created something I never would have imagined possible." This acknowledgement, coming from the man whose approval she had so missed, represented for Emmeline a form of accomplishment as significant as all the institutional recognitions she had received. Later in the day, as the midday heat imposed the traditional meridian pause, Nathaniel joined her under the shaded arbor of the inner courtyard. He carried a tray with 2 glasses of fresh lemonade and an envelope. "What is it?" asked Emmeline, intrigued by his expression, at once serious and slightly playful. "A proposal," he replied, handing her the envelope. "Or perhaps a question." Inside, Emmeline discovered plans, those of the mill house but transformed, enlarged, with a new wing that would extend toward the west, harmoniously integrating an annex building that was falling into ruin. "I thought we could develop the project," explained Nathaniel, his gaze attentive to her reactions. "Create more studios for artists in residence, a specialized library on ceramic arts, perhaps even a small museum space that would trace the history of New England pottery." Emmeline studied the plans with attention, impressed by the way they respected the architectural integrity of the mill house while infusing it with new life. But beyond the technical aspects, she perceived what this proposal truly meant: a long-term commitment, a shared vision of their common future. "It's ambitious," she finally said, raising her eyes to him, "and magnificent." Nathaniel smiled, visibly relieved by her positive reaction. "There's something else," he added, extracting a small object from his pocket. "Something more personal." It wasn't a ring, as Emmeline might have expected, but an ancient key patinated by time attached to a simple leather cord. "The key to the house where I was born, in New York," he explained. "It's the only object I've kept from my childhood. I would like you to accept it, as a symbol of what I offer you, my past, my present, and all the future we could build together." This gesture of a moving simplicity touched Emmeline far more deeply than a conventional proposal could have. It perfectly corresponded to the relationship they had built, anchored in mutual respect, understanding of each other's roots, and the shared vision of a future that would honor these origins while creating something new. "I accept," she said simply, taking the key and placing it around her neck, where it joined the ceramic medallion her father had offered her, two talismans representing the worlds she had learned to reconcile. In the evening, the Mill House came alive for an intimate celebration, not a traditional anniversary party, but a commemoration of this year of transformations. Emmeline's family was present, of course, but also Madison, who had come specially from New York, some artists in residence, and the closest friends they had made in New England. Under the stars progressively appearing in the New England sky, surrounded by those who had accompanied her journey, Emmeline realized how the circle had closed while expanding. She hadn't had to choose between Salem and New York, between tradition and innovation, between her family roots and her love for Nathaniel. She had found a third way, one that integrated these apparent contradictions into a new harmony. Later in the evening, as conversations continued softly in the courtyard illuminated by lanterns, Nathaniel led her aside toward the century-old maple that watched over the mill house for generations. "Do you remember my question that first afternoon?" he murmured, his eyes reflecting the gentle light of the stars. "May I continue?" repeated Emmeline, smiling at the memory of that moment that seemed to belong to another life. "I ask it again," he said, taking her hands in his. "No longer for a moment, but for a lifetime. May I continue? To build with you, to learn with you, to transform and be transformed by you." Emmeline's answer was as simple as it was profound, as anchored in her reconciled past, as it was turned toward the possibilities to come. "Yes, let's continue together." In the warm air of that summer night, the scent of lavender and wild blueberry still floated, unchanged since that first afternoon. But Emmeline was no longer the same. The shy young potter from Salem had found her voice, her balance, her unique way of being in the world, and in this transformation she had perhaps offered others, her father, her family, her community, permission to find their own path between preservation and renewal. Under the century-old maple, silent witness to so many human stories, Emmeline and Nathaniel sealed their promise with a kiss that tasted of both past and future. And in this moment, suspended between worlds, between times, between the identities they had been and those they were becoming together, they breathed in the scent of possibilities, that of a life that would be neither completely of New England nor completely of New York, but authentically their own.